Hi everyone, Talia from Zart Art, and today we're going to be making a Pete Cromer inspired watercolour collage. So here's an example of what we'll be making today. So I've got two watercolour collages here, both in the style of Pete Cromer, but just made a little bit different, so we're not completely copying his work, but just using some of his simple shapes, bright colours that he's well known for. He is a contemporary Australian artist, so it's a great one to look at if you're working with local artists or want to talk about local Australian artists. So, some of the materials that you'll need for this activity are some watercolour paper, watercolour paints, and otherwise just simple things like a pencil, a watercolour brush, and if you would like to use some of these stencils to help you with some of the shapes that we're going to be creating, they're very handy to have as well. So to begin our watercolour collage, I'm going to start by drawing a draft of our little kookaburra, which is what we're going to create today. So just using a pencil, a piece of paper, when you are drawing out your draft, what you want to focus on are those simple shapes, not making anything too complicated, and thinking about layering as well. Pete Cromer uses a lot of layers in his work, as you can see on this one over here. We've got our large shape in the background, and then we've got some slightly bigger shapes on top, and then our small simple shapes over that. So all building those layers to almost make it look like a 3D collage, but that really adds to the work. So have a think about that as you're drawing out your draft. So while I'm working on my draft, I'm going to start with the background shape. So think of a silhouette of an animal. So you might be working with native Australian birds like Cromer has done in some of his series, or you might be looking at your own pets, depending on what themes you're looking at in class. You just want to focus on the silhouette to begin with. Okay, now I've finished drawing up my draft, and he's a little smooshed in, so I would highly recommend to draw this on larger paper or draw it in a smaller scale. But this is just as a reference image for yourself, so you know where you're doing your layers and even what colours you might want to use. So if you did want to draw this to scale, what I would do next is cut this out and use this as a template to trace over on my watercolour paper. But because this isn't to scale, I'm going to redraw my background onto a larger piece of paper and then watercolour that in. Now I've got my little silhouette of the kookaburra. I'm going to watercolour this, and because it's mostly white, I'm just going to use some white and a little bit of black to add a hint of grey tones in it. I've also got some pre-made watercolour papers, which is something that you might want to do if you're breaking this down into several classes. Just have a whole lot of sheets of paper that you watercolour paint so it's ready for the next lesson, and then you don't have to wait for things to dry. So just using my watercolours and my water brush, I'm just going to apply a little bit of white and a little bit of black to make that background colour on my kookaburra. Now I've watercolored in that background shape for my kookaburra, and if you wanted to, you can try some different watercolor techniques like wet on wet or different ways of blending the colors together. If you do want a bit of texture, or you might not want texture at all and to have just a very flat color, you could also use acrylic paints to do that as well, but we're just going to leave that to the side to dry and bring out our pre-made watercolor papers. What I'm going to do is look at my draft, or look at my finished piece as well, and work on some of these larger shapes, and then just cutting those out, and I can make some of these bigger areas before sticking them onto my background layer, or I can just have them all together and then do my composition before deciding where I'm going to stick everything. So as you're working, it might be a good idea to hold up your background shape close to the shapes that you're drawing so you get a good idea of size. It's always better to draw too large than too small because you can cut things down easier to make it fit whatever shape or size you're working with. But if you draw it too small and you don't have enough watercolor paper, then you'll have to make more, and then that's a big time waster. So try and join things up together to see how big they are, draw it bigger and cut it out bigger than what you might need, and then trim it down as you go. Now I've cut out all my little pieces, and as I've been cutting, I've been putting them down to arrange my composition. So it's not completely the same as my drawing, which you might discover isn't the way you want to go anyway. As you're putting things together, you might think a shape looks better somewhere else. You might move things around or choose different shapes, but because nothing's stuck down, nothing is set in stone, so you can move things around if you want to, change some colors or add a few more things, but I'm quite happy with that composition. I think that looks nice. What I would suggest is, if you've got cameras, iPads in the room, is to take a photo of the composition, and then you can put everything away and start sticking down, and then refer to your photo so you know where everything will sit, because once you've taken pieces out, you might forget where a certain shape goes, because you will need to take things away before you put them all back together. So I'm going to start by using some super tack and sticking down some of my larger pieces together. Because you've got some larger pieces with a few different layers sitting on top, you can start by putting those all together before you work on your larger shape. So now I've super tacked all of my pieces down. If you're finding that some of your paper's warping a little bit, like this background layer, it's good just to stack a few books on top of it to flatten it out, and then the next day it'll be completely flat, and then you can glue down any pieces that are starting to lift a little bit. But otherwise I'm happy with that. If you want some different background choices, you can put them on different coloured pieces of paper and see which one works best. This is a good way to teach kids about different ways of displaying their artwork. So whether you want to put it on some plain paper, try a different shape like this circular wooden board, which is really lovely to display on, then you can just trim around the edges of your finished piece, and then that will fit nicely onto a different shape. But you can choose different colours for display. You can display it on paper, on card, you can paint the backgrounds or even use watercolour on those backgrounds as well, but there's lots of different options for display. So this is a really fun activity that's suitable for a range of different year levels. If you want to make something that's quite complicated and an individualised work where the students come up with their own design from scratch, then you could definitely do this with secondary students. If you want to keep it simple and just focus on cutting skills, you could copy a Pete Cromer work directly. He even has printouts that you can access to colour in and cut out and to make your own collage, simple as that. But for this kind of activity, I would probably recommend around middle primary to senior primary, and then work from that to suit your students. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.